Now, Tony, the European signatories to the nuclear deal promised to compensate the U.S. unilateral pullout of the deal, but in practice, they did nothing to help Iran reap the economic benefits of the agreement. How can the European parties that have not fulfilled their obligations under the agreement expect Tehran to stay in the deal, and that in return for nothing?
Well, that's a really good question, isn't it? I mean, I think the European so-called leaders, who, by the way, are appointees, they're not elected by the people of Europe at the Brussels EU Commission, they're sleepwalking into a potential war in the Middle East, because the JCPOA, this Iran nuclear deal, is probably the most important safeguard against a serious Middle East conflict in the future. But this announcement today by the French is really saying something which many people have been suspecting for a long, long time, and we've just heard from Mr. Jatras there too, echoing what I would say is absolutely now clear, is that the EU has been saying for a long time, the European countries, Brussels, that they're a separate organisation to the United States, that they disagree with the United States, and we've seen today that they're just simply going into line exactly with Pentagon, US aggressive foreign policy in the Middle East. I mean, you have to remember, of course, that Macron, the government of France, is not popular. We've got protests going on for the last year all over France against this guy, trying to remove Macron, and it's absolutely 100% clear now that the EU doesn't actually have any kind of real independent policy. It's just doing what the Americans want. We've got a usual sort of situation that we've seen in gangster movies with the good cop, bad cop approach. The United States being the bad cops and the EU playing good cop, but actually trying to get the same ends.
Now, James, how much is the EU to blame for this current situation, as the landmark 2015 nuclear deal is teetering on the brink? Is the EU unwilling or incapable of delivering, on its commitments after the U.S. pullout?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think on the unwilling part, it would require them to have the gumption to stand up to Washington, and they don't. And the fact is, maybe they are unable to do so because they really are afraid of what would happen to them if they did move forward to this, that Washington would take steps that would damage the euro, damage their economies, and that they would pay for it domestically. And as was pointed out by my colleague, unfortunately, yes, Mr. Macron is under a lot of domestic pressure. There's a degree of brutality being used against the protesters that is not being covered by the world media. He's got his own problems, and I think that's one reason he's trying to show what a great world statesman he is. On the other hand, if we look at American policy, I think maybe Mr. Trump was under the impression that if he shot down the JCPOA, he could come up with a much better deal, because that's what he likes to do. I don't think anybody in his administration shares that vision. They're all a bunch of neoconservatives. They want regime change in Tehran, plain and simple, and they're willing to risk war or even to launch a war to get it. And unfortunately, I think that's part of what is going on here. For example, one of the accusations against Iran is exceeding the limits on enriched uranium, which they can't export because of the American financial sanctions, and then that's turned around and used as an accusation against Iran. So that's part of the game that's going on here.
Exactly. Now, Tony, the French defense minister just recently criticized the United States over what is described as unanswered attacks in recent months threatening the Persian Gulf. And by that, she's referring to Iran downing an intruding U.S. drone a short while ago, if you remember. What can be inferred from this posturing on the part of France?
Look, I think this sort of statement, it echoes around the world, particularly in the Western media. It has a big effect on people. This is the ordinary population sees the dripping effect day after day of negative stories about Iran. This is what we actually call, in old-fashioned terms, propaganda. It's the sort of thing that happens when you have bad, biased journalism, and we're seeing the same sort of thing going around the Western world today about Russia. Books coming out about how evil Putin is, attacks on the Russian athletes. These are all stories which are designed as propaganda. They're not real journalism. Well, one example we've seen, for example, is the chief rabbi of the UK, Ephraim Mervis. He is calling Jeremy Corbyn, who's standing in our general election, stands a reasonable chance of winning, maybe some say, as an anti-Semite. Well, that they've reported, but they haven't reported that the United European Jewish Rabbi, Meir Weinberger, has said the total opposite, that Jeremy Corbyn is definitely not an anti-Semite and his policies are absolutely right for the Middle East. And this is all because what they're trying to do is really shape public opinion. I mean, what we're talking about now is economic warfare, but this is what we're seeing in the media is psychological warfare. It's actually trying to prepare the public and to shape public opinion to make war more possible. You remember the WMD before the illegal Iraq war? Exactly the same sort of thing is happening now in the mass media in the West, and with the economic sanctions and economic warfare too. So this has not really been explained at all in the Western press anywhere, that they're trying to soften up the public, possibly to make similar sorts of mistakes with Iran that they made with Iraq back in 2003. And that, I think, is the most important message, is we've really got to get that out to the world, particularly in the West, that with this sort of horrendous illegal war must never be allowed to happen again.
Now, James, the French Defense Minister, Florence Parly, also says that France deplores President Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal that led to the reimposition of sanctions. She's also criticizing Tehran for gradually rolling back on the commitments within the deal. So she's blaming both Tehran and Washington, disregarding her own country's negligence of the nuclear deal. Let's have your take.
Well, this is another example where the French have a policy that is so clever nobody can understand it, not even themselves. That, yes, they accuse the United States, I think accurately, of backing out of the deal. Then they accuse Iran of violating the agreement that they had been adhering to, because in large part of the U.S. actions to force their non-compliance with the deal, which could then be used as an accusation against them. We should ask, to what end? And this is where I think Tony is right. We're not talking about information warfare, financial war. My fear is that this is all aimed toward warfare, an open war against Iran. Let's remember, we came very close to a real war against Iran during the shoot down of that unmanned drone. And by a number of accounts from inside the government, I was told that we were within 10 minutes of launching that war before President Trump decided not to do it. And I don't think people fully appreciate how dangerous the cliff edge that we're balanced on. We saw recently an announcement that Iran will be having joint military maneuvers with Russia and China. This is the kind of war that, unlike the Iraq war in 2003, could turn into a much bigger war if people in Washington are foolish enough to unleash this catastrophe on the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tony, Federica Mogherini said recently it's increasingly difficult to keep the nuclear deal, but she stressed that they will try to continue keeping the agreement in place and overcome the difficulties that they are facing. So how on earth is she going to do that? I mean, by just asking Iran to stay in the deal?
Well, she's saying all the right things, but of course the European Commission is being replaced at the end of this month, and she's out. She'll be going into retirement. I mean, I think another way of seeing all this is that this foreign policy fueling potential war in the Middle East is actually an aspect of domestic policy in France and in other countries in Europe, and of course in the US too, in that you've got increasingly beleaguered politicians and senior, what we could call the deep state, the senior people, the permanent government, the civil service, and the technocrats in those countries in Europe and the United States, who are finding that their population is not supporting them anymore. I mean, you've got technocrat, plutocrats, you could call it just an oligarchic government in many countries in Europe, where governments in ordinary countries like Greece and Italy are having officials, senior officials like finance ministers imposed on them from Brussels, which they've never elected these people, but Brussels says, well, if you want to stay in the euro and you want to continue getting loans from the European Central Bank, you've got to have this particular person. We're ending up with a technocratic situation where the ordinary people get no say whatever in those that are running the most important financial policies. And the other aspect of that in Europe, I don't think this is quite so bad in the US, but it's certainly happening in Europe, is that the rich are paying no tax. And they're making sure that they fund governments in order to make sure they don't ever have to pay tax. The government is servicing debt and people are finding that the services right across the board are being withdrawn. So people are paying tax really just to simply service debt and not to actually get any services in returns for it. And that is really potentially a recipe for the sorts of unrest we've seen in France, where people are finding it almost impossible to make enough money in order to make ends meet. So their disposable income is going down to virtually zero. Now, this sort of thing brings populations into conflict with their governments. The best and easiest thing, the simplest thing, even if it's rather an evil thing to do, is for those governments to turn attention away to possible foreign wars. And that seems to me a major aspect of why the French are now starting to say, well, actually, we don't really care about the JCPOA anymore. We would like to direct our public's attention and our media's attention away from France.
Now, James, Federica Mogherini is also saying that they have constantly asked Iran to reverse the scale-back measures and go back to full compliance. On what ground can she have such an expectation of Iran?
Very little ground. As been, I think has been said several times in this program, how do you expect Iran to maintain one side of an agreement that the other side doesn't want to comply with its obligations? Just a footnote on what Tony said on the American tax system. Yeah, the Republicans and Democrats shadow box over the top income tax rate, but the real super rich, the ones who get investment income, pay about half the same rate as what is charged on income tax, because it's not income, it's investment income, which is different. Yes, I think domestic politics are much at work here. Look at President Trump under siege over Ukraine and Russia because he doesn't want to give weapons to Ukraine. I mean, because he withheld for a time weapons to Ukraine, which evidently they have a God-given right to, according to the foreign policy establishment. I think we see this across the board, where he wanted to have better relations with Russia. He wants to get out of Syria and Afghanistan. He hasn't been allowed to do that. I think he probably thought he could get a better deal with Iran, just like he hoped, I think, to get a deal with North Korea, which is not happening either. Everywhere you see permanent government, bureaucracy, professional foreign service, of which I used to be a member, and the intelligence community wanting to dictate policy, which simply means more war, more empire, more sanctions, more misery, and this is going to take the world into a very, very bad place.
Now, Tony, here's what Iran argues about the scaling back, measures. Iran says that it's kept the door of diplomacy open this way by giving the EU side of the deal 2 months ultimatums within this scale back program, so that the European side, get their act together, they can take action on their obligations toward the Islamic Republic. And that's also Tehran is saying that it wants to keep the deal. That's why it's doing this. Let's have your comment.
Well, no, I totally agree with that. But you know what? This is what they call in the trade the wrong story. It's not being reported at all. So what we're seeing in the press is all sorts of criticism of Iran. Oh gosh, look, they're starting to enrich uranium again. But there is never any explanation as to why, and no detail and no context given in the Western media. Very much like, no mention of Mayor Weinberger from United European Jews supporting the Jeremy Corbyn, who, by the way, happens to be pro-Palestinian. He takes very much a Palestinian line on human rights, pro-Palestinian line. So we're seeing all over the mass media here these sorts of omissions in journalism, really. I mean, you can't call it journalism, it's propaganda. So the whole point really being is to push, to maneuver public opinion. Most members of the public simply don't have the time to go into detail. They trust what they see on the television, read in the newspapers, hear on the radio, and they think to themselves, well, why would they be lying to me? And they think they understand what's going on. Unfortunately, the mass media has become the spearhead of the war machine, just like we saw in Iraq. And I think actually maybe it's quite possible that a different regime in the UK might take a very, very different, as we've got a general election going on, a very different attitude to this. That may upset the apple cart. So let's hope we see a little bit of change in British foreign policy.
Let's wait and see. All right. On that note, we'll come to the end of this program. Let me thank our guests. We had former U.S. diplomat James Jatras, who joined us from Washington, D.C., and investigative journalist Tony Gosling from Bristol. And thank you for watching this program. We'll see you next time.